absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to our 7th webinar in the Security and Justice Futures series. It's a collaboration between the University of Glasgow, the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, the Kenyan National Crime Research Centre, then my institution, the Global Risk Governance Programme, which is based at the University of Cape Town, and the Center for Human Rights and Policy Studies, from which our main speaker, Dr. Mutahi, comes from. So today's session, we will focus on permissive space and policing practices in Mathare and Kaptembwo, informal settlements in Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Mutahi will speak to us for about 30 minutes, and after him, Dr. Guy Lamb from the University of Stellenbosch will respond. Just a bit of background to Dr. Mutahi. He's a researcher and expert in policing, security and violence. In 2022, he received his PhD titled Statehood, Sovereignty and Identities, exploring policing in Kenya's informal settlements of Mathare and Kaptembwo. So he's speaking about some of his findings today. His thesis contributes new empirical and analytical knowledge on policing in Kenya, offering critical insights into the complex relationships between state actors, non-state actors, and citizens. Dr. Mutahi has led numerous studies on political stability and violence in Kenya, exploring national and cross-border threats, as well as security responses. Then it's also a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Guy Lamb. Guy and myself, we've known each other, I think, for the better part of our respective adult lives. He was a tutor, a political science tutor of mine in the early 90s. And since then, he's had a very interesting career, and often our careers were interlinked. He has been at the ISS, the Institute for Security Studies. He was running for many, many years the safety and what was it? The safety initiative at the University of Cape Town. And he's now a senior lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch. And he also is on the National Planning Commission of the Republic of South Africa. Just to give you a bit of a rundown to how this webinar is going to work out, Patrick, Dr. Mutahi, is going to speak for about half an hour, 30 minutes. Thereafter, Guy will respond for about 10 minutes. And then we will open the floor to Q&A, any comments, any issues you want to raise. Also, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording the session. However, the recording will be switched off for the Q&A session. And we also request when during the Q&A session, please raise your hand or switch on your camera. And before asking your questions or making your comment, please introduce yourself briefly, just telling us who you are and where you come from. Okay, without further ado, I hand over to Patrick. Patrick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Annette. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So, yes, as Annette introduced me, my name is Patrick Mutahi. So what I'm going to present is part of my findings for my PhD, which really looked at how people within the informal settlements of Mathare and Kaptembwo in Kenya organize their security. And so this is part of my findings. In one of the chapters, I also have published an article on the same in the Journal of African Studies. So you can also find more details of this piece of work there. So briefly, the center, we do research policy think tank. It's a policy research think tank in Nairobi. And our work primarily involves around working on security policing issues on many different ways. So without further ado, let me go into the heart of it. So where do I start my conversation is, as many of you know, that the studies of about Kenyan police and the nature of the state is that it's been extensively discussed, and part of the themes that we see is discussions on just from the colonial time, the violent nature of the colonial state. And this is the kind of policing that we have continued seeing the post-independent government. Many of these scholars, and this is just a sample of them, have done a lot of work really discussing how do the police manage people, what are the different ways that they do that. We have seen discussions on the various perceptions of how they deal with people who are in the middle class, upper class, and in the informal settlements, which is the focus of my study. And also increasingly, we have seen many discussions in the latter years of 2015 to the present about police themselves acting as vigilantes. And the killings of many people, especially in the informal settlements. So all this is where I situate my discussion. So it's an addition to many of the great research that has taken place and still continues to take place in how do we understand policing in the informal settlements. And I make a contribution that really extends that work. One is to look at how then is impunity negotiated, because as you can see, these are very, very much spaces where there's a lot of violence and accountability is very low. So I'm looking at Mathare and Kaptembwo informal settlements. What I discuss is that how is impunity negotiated by the different policing actors? How do they get away or how do they get along between the police and many other actors that we have doing policing work? And there are two arguments that I fall into this. One is I understand sovereignty and impunity as not static, so it's claimed, contested and negotiated by the different policing actors. And for this discussion I'm looking at sovereign powers, and these policing actors are sovereign actors because they do, and as I will discuss in my findings, they have the ability to kill, punish, discipline with impunity. And this impunity flows from the different actors. May they be the police, the youth groups, community policing actors, and the like. And again, my key argument in my work is that I see sovereignty as a very, very much socially constructed source of power. So there will be the legal definitions about who has a sovereign power. I know that, but I argue that this actually is a very much socially constructed source of power that we need to understand it in that way. And the second key argument I'll put forward is that the different levels of impunity are actually very vital in mediating the state of play within the informal settlements of Mathare and Kaptembwo and possibly in similar settings. That this impunity sometimes allows the police to outsource violence. It sometimes allows other policing actors to engage in violence and sovereign actions, knowing that they'll be protected from the law. So those two key arguments really flow in my understanding of how then do we deal with impunity and understanding about violence within this settlement. My main thesis is then anchored in what the idea or the concept of permissive space. And shortly I'm going to discuss what's permissive space, but it really helps us to understand how do the policing actors in the plural context, because in the areas where I did my work in Mathare and Kaptembwo there are different actors of people doing the policing work. There will be the youth groups, the women, the police, Nyumba Kumi, the 10 households, how they put themselves. But then is asking ourselves, then what are the different power relationships and sovereign issues and how are they negotiated? And the permissive space for me helps to understand the different ways that people negotiate. How then do we push this elastic band of sovereignty being a social construction? It also helps us to see how are the different powers are negotiated. How do people then do a performance of the policing. No, as we know that policing is very much a performance in some of the instances. And then how is this violence still instrumentalized within the permissive space? So just a quick background on where we are talking about Mathare and Kaptembwo. So Mathare is in Nairobi, Kaptembwo is in Nakuru, which is almost 3 hours north of Nairobi. And these areas really are informal settlements, and these informal settlements have quite some unique features that flow in each other. One, there's socioeconomic challenges, and here is lack of water, land tenure. Many people have written about that. The precarity of life there is actually very, very short. We have very, very much punitive policing in this area. So the police would really, at some times, engage in a lot of violence. The police also have, because of the high levels of corruption, not only there, but generally in society, but in these areas that there's a lot of informality that happens. And all these actors then work together. And sometimes they compete against each other. The instances, as I'll discuss, because of the plurality of violence and how people then are able to know where to go to get help in terms of, do you go and talk to the local gangs? Do you go talk to the community policing? I know that. So there's a lot of collaboration and sometimes tension with that. So this is the context of both Mathare and Kaptembwo. That really we are going to discuss on. And again, this is part of the data that I collected then in 2018, 2019, before I did my dissertation in 2021. Interviewed just that 4 men and 45 from Mathare, had 40 key informants of women, and 28 from Mathare, had focus group discussions, interviewed the chief and the police in both areas. So all this, and I used multiple prior snowball networks to discuss the findings and doing the analysis. So now to get to the discussion is, what are we talking about when we talk about permissive space? So this is a term that was coined by Sarah Jane Cooper in her work on sovereignty policing in a permissive space in her work in South Africa. So she also focused on informal settlements in Durban, South Africa. And I borrowed the concept from her work on that. So her main thesis is that we need to recognize in these settings how people who act illegally must negotiate impunity, not only with the state, but also with other citizens, because other citizens can report them. And this is just to avoid repercussions. And this is really draws that we need, if we understand that, that within these spaces that she called permissive, because they are permissive in the real sense, as we will discuss, then you're able to see why impunity would be a way of life within those informal settlements. Different parameters that are put forward for us to understand permissive space. One, it's a very fluid concept, and different actors can establish, can extend, contract, close, and collapse it. And I'm going to come back to this, discussing Mathare and Kaptembwo. The permissive space can be stable over time. It can continue for a long time. And many people can be within that space. And again, because this is a fluid and it's an idea space, so it's we can't say that it's static in one place. There are different spaces that would be considered as permissive space. It also can contract, and I'll come back to that. And sometimes it's very much invisible. You really need to be part of it then to know that it's actually the space that you are in. Other times it can collapse, and anyone within the actors, the state or non-state actors, can collapse this space. And that means that the ability to continue acting with impunity and organizing violence then is without being responsible with impunity is really taken away. So these are the different parameters of the permissive space, and they're the ones that I'll be speaking to with Mathare and Kaptembwo, and drawing from the different interviews and case studies that I did, and to extend the discussions about policing. So let me then share some of the findings that I got. So this permissive space, one of the things that I found out was that it's a site of power contestation. One of the, during my field work, is that I did attend many of the public forums, and these are the ones that were being either the chief barazas or some police meetings, and all that. So one of the meetings I attended in Kaptembwo Police was to address the issue about gang violence. So there is a gang called Confirm, which is in Nakuru in Kaptembwo. And in this meeting, the police were talking about how they would be using violence on the group, and this is mainly on the young men, saying that they're the ones who have been snatching people's handbags, they're the ones who have been stealing from people, they mug and everyone, and everything. And one of the causes is that the police were saying that they are more than, that they had many of them every year, and they are going to ensure that they have the numbers to tackle the criminals. And then a threat was put saying that shall evil and you'll prosper, the police are not taking any chances. But then within that same meeting, because it was open now for discussion after the police made the intervention and about the Confirm group, some women spoke and they really challenged this narrative. And they cast saying that, look, the police, that these are really our sons. These are the people that we know. And if you want us to take them to the police for processing, then you are going to do that. But we are not going to accept the police coming to threaten that you are going to shoot our sons. And here they went on and challenged, saying that there needs to be much more accountability for policies of violence. And for me, this was very telling because this was it was an open forum, and the several women who spoke, and also some of the young men who spoke, echoed that, and they really pushed back on the police and policed that. And here the police were presenting themselves as the sovereigns, that they have ability to carry out the violence, to intervene and restore order. But as you can see, this became a negotiation that between the residents and the police. And part of it was calling that we need more consistent application of the law. We need a state, and the residents were projecting a state where it's law and order and not just impunity on violence. Yet the police had created this space where they said they would come in and shoot people as they want. A similar theme I encountered in Mathare, where we have this display of what some of the scholars have called killer cops. So these are many plainclothes police officers who walk around Mathare, and what they do is to sometimes they arrest people, sometimes they disappear suspects of crime. And in my interviews, I found, it was a different takes. There are some people who really went on to support the police within for them to doing this work. Yet other people are saying, no, we can't have the police doing that. And in many of the forums that I attended, which were put together by either the chief or the police, is that this really negotiation between the authorities and the people was quite prominent, which echoed what I had also encountered within Kaptembwo. And for me, then within the space that of the permissive space in terms of the police and the state shows one the limitations of the state sovereignty discussions, because they're very much limited because of these negotiations that happen within that. The second thing that really comes out in my discussion in my paper is on the fluidity of this permissive space. Within Mathare, there is, again, the so-called killer cops. Sometimes they operate in unmarked cars, and the prominent one is the Toyota Probox. It has been used a lot within the informal settlement to arrest some of the suspects, and this has not the real names of the people that I interviewed, but one of the prominent police officers, I would call him Mwangi, and he's widely known. So he doesn't hide, even if he doesn't have the identification of the police. He's known for or suspected of carrying out part of the extrajudicial killings. And I spoke to this gentleman called Minor, who really said that that part of his friend had been arrested and he was detained within the pro box. And everyone I talked to knew that if you're put in the pro box, there are two things would happen. Either you would be disappeared or found dead. The second one is that you'll get out with a warning or you have to pay a bribe. And that's what happened to Minor. And he was released because, again, there was interventions from the human rights players there. They have this rapid response of calling out for police once an alert goes out, someone has been arrested and put in the pro box. But later he was shot by the police after that. And for me, this then showed the pro box for me emerges as one of the avenues that I saw it being a permissive space for several things. One is it's a space where there's bribery and informal warnings that are given. Some of the narratives I got is that people are told to leave the informal settlement if you don't die. Some people paid some money and all that. And this is very invisible negotiations. You can only get from the people who are within this space. Some of the times, as I said, the police just use it to threaten and control people within it. And for a very, very long time, we have not had any accountability. So about the police violence using and people being arrested with one unmarked car, police officers who don't identify themselves according to the law. And really this space was used in many ways by the police. Sometimes people would be released and told that, because there are no records, then you're told you watch your back, but I know who you are. And that means that it becomes a very unstable and can be a space that is opened up for renegotiation. And many of the young men that I met were saying they were fearing because they don't have a place to go and say that I wanted to follow up my case. So this is a space that really is used by the police at the time that I did the research to really negotiate impunity. It was used by the residents to negotiate for their freedom. And it was used also, as a space to close the permissive space. So when someone is banished, that place is now is closed, and if you come back, then you're going to be arrested, and the police then would, and that's a threat that I used to have it. So it was using those different ways to close the space, to expand it, and also to use it for impunity. And lastly, that I found that this permissive space also been used a lot by citizens. And here I just pick one of the boda riders. So for those, the boda riders are the motorcycles that are normally used for carrying goods and people. So in Kaptembwo, I interviewed several of them, and there were many cases that I got about them as a group, either issuing warning to suspected criminals. Sometimes they would beat them, and sometimes there would be some occasional killings. What was interesting is they, and I remember encountering one case of where they beaten a crime suspect and handed over to the police. I was at the police station, and they brought someone there bleeding, and they handed over the police, and that was it. And they left the police station. And talking to them, you could clearly see one, they put themselves as sovereigns, that they would establish fear to discourage crime. They would decide what level of punishment. In some of the instances, they were saying they would beat someone to an extent where they feel it's enough. Enough definitely is very much subjective. Other times they would, even have some cases, several cases, they said that it was suspected. They're the ones who had killed some of the suspected criminals. And really those no cases that could get. So these were really cases of impunity. But looking then at that space, there are different elements that I came to pick out. One is there are very, very much strong interpersonal relationships that reinforce the permissive space and enabled it then to continue for long. One is the police had outsourced the violence, crime control to them, so they didn't mind them, the riders coming to do all that. Then also some of the bodas are owned by police, and this is an extra income that they get. So why would you go against the people who give you also income? The third deal that I got was because of the bribes. They give the bodas give the police the bribes, and again this makes the interpersonal relationships to be much more stronger. So all these then would make also the police turn a blind eye to what would be obvious road that they're supposed to take efforts to address some of these activities, like overloading. You'll have one carrying like 3 people. They don't have helmets, insurance, and licenses. But these interpersonal relationships then are reinforced and help the boda riders really to commit illegal activities with impunity and really to sustain this permissive space. So all these interpersonal relationships helped these spaces to solidify. It helped them to be sovereigns with impunity. But also part of my feeling and part of my discussion within my work is that really these forms of street justice is a critique of the police not doing their work, but also it complements police work because police are able to say that they, that here there's efforts that are made, or the areas are much more secure because of that. Other times, as I said, that the police closed this space. So there's a time they gave warnings to the boda riders: do not get involved in doing this in terms of violence, because if you do it again, then we are going to prosecute you. And some of these times is because either there's pressure from the society that we don't see more people being killed. I know that, and the boda riders would really, conform to that. Few cases, I think I got like only 2 cases of boda riders that were taken to court because of the violence, and here this denotes that the space was collapsed, that there's no more chance of any negotiations for impunity. And this really then makes us see the different ways that people negotiate, they're able to live through the impunity spaces within Kaptembwo and Mathare. So in conclusion, what my discussion is that we need, in a plural setting of, because that's what we have, a plural setting of the security actors is different. They all claim authority, sometimes through street violence, but they all claim authority to something when they are doing the policing. And here, for me, then this permissive space helps us to see how do they claiming authority, then also how able to create their own rules of engagement. As you have seen the boda riders, the young people saying, that this is how we are going to do the police, how the police also unmarked vehicles. They're able to create their own rules of engagement because that's not how they're supposed to do. And these relationships also change a lot. The power dynamics change a lot. So we can't say that one entity has power. It's a very, very fluid space. And it's only that if you understand then that, we're able to see that why the impunity then still thrives through the informal negotiations between the different actors. And then finally, just 3 things to raise then to end my presentation, is that really my work looks at, we need to go beyond seeing the monopoly of violence as a state, that this very much used by everyone within such spaces like Mathare and Kaptembwo, that we don't have a very much static sovereignty aspects of just a state. It's also that I argue that impunity is not just a byproduct of weak institutions. There's a whole scholarly thesis about impunity just because we have weak institutions. But my discussion is that impunity is actually negotiated. and sustained through very much informal arrangements. So it's not, we can have, yes, we can agree sometimes we have the weak institutions, but they are really not absent. They are still there, and they are part of the negotiation of this impunity, sometimes to ensure that life continues. And also it becomes easy even for people to negotiate their life with the different policing actors. And that raises that I raise critical questions about how we define justice. What is justice and security? And legitimacy really beyond the legal frameworks. Because there are many instances of the young men that I saw, the many instances of the women that I encountered, that really, the question, the whole about legitimacy. As I started the women in Kaptembwo, they were questioning the legitimacy of the police really to get in violence. So Annette, thanks so much, and that's I would be happy to get to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was fascinating. I'm going to hand over straight over to Guy. Guy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Annette. And Patrick, that's a great presentation. I certainly had the privilege of reading your paper in African Studies recently and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think the kind of point here is that if we look globally at police and populations, we've got, large numbers of people, probably larger populations living in the global south who live in kind of poor, under-resourced areas, live in informal settlements, live in slums, within urban centers, on the fringes of urban centers. Yet the sort of policing literature we have largely speaks to well-resourced areas, speaks to the global north. We have very few studies actually on the global south, and particularly within Africa. And so that's why I read your study with great interest, because also I have been working on similar issues to a degree within South Africa. And of course, there is a scholarship that's been around probably for about 10, 15 years, focusing on Latin America, looking predominantly within Brazil, but in a few other Latin American countries around the favelas and the kind of policing that takes place in those favelas. So I particularly like the use of the term permissive space. And as you did acknowledge, this is something that S.J. Kupernock sort of coined through her work within a part of South Africa in the KwaZulu-Natal province, looking at informal settlements there in close proximity to a major city, either on the periphery or within the actual city itself. But even before Kupernock's work is the sort of work of Bruce Baker, who was trying to, professor of policing, who was really trying to understand policing in Africa, and sort of made similar types of findings in his more kind of general work on multi-country study. Within the South African context, as well as Kupernock's work is predated by Johnny Steinberg's work. He's a very thin book, thin blue, but makes some very important statements around policing and analysis around policing. Also identifies the sort of arrangements where police have to negotiate some form of influence in the context of informal settlements. So it doesn't use the term permissive space, but certainly identifies this particular issue. And I think your work is very exciting because it really sort of suggests that, what one is seeing in countries like South Africa, what one has been identified in places like Brazil is happening elsewhere and happening within Kenya. And, very similar dynamics I noticed within what you have found in your research around the relationship between police and other types of security actors within the context of an informal settlement, particularly the boda, who are providing a sort of transport service. We find a very similar arrangement within the South African context where considerable policing with informal settlements is undertaken by minibus taxi drivers. I suppose you would call them matatus within the Eastern African context, who are incredibly powerful, well-resourced. Police do own minibus taxis, but they perform a very important social control function, policing function, punishment function within these informal settlements. But before I get into a bit more of the detail, I just wanted to sort of complement what you've been saying, because I'm no expert on Kenya. I was a co-author on a paper many, many years ago that looked at public health data, and it looked at police shooting of suspects. And the one finding of that was very worryingly that police are responsible for a significant number of homicides within Nairobi, particularly in the informal settlements, but certainly haven't done any work on policing itself within Kenya. So I'm going to be borrowing on most of my South African research, but also in a few other countries too, Liberia, Papua New Guinea, where I've done more research recently. But I want to just compliment what you've been saying about looking at this, the notion of collapsing and closing these permissive spaces. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about this, because it's not something that's constant, it's something that can change. And your research is looking at what can change on a day-to-day basis. Where I think, which is quite interesting, is what does external factors do to this permissive space, particularly around moral panics. So if I use sort of South African example, is you have, certainly the permissive space approach and framework can be used very effectively to understand day-to-day, everyday policing within an informal settlement within South Africa. But what happens is there are moral panics around crime, moral panics around migration, moral panics around extortion, moral panics around this issue we have in South Africa called zamazamas, which is gold miners who engage in artisanal mining in abandoned gold mining shafts within the context of cities. And there's kind of relationships that emerge around, policing array relationships that emerge around that, and obviously negotiations with the police. But the kind of closing down of these spaces is really interesting when these moral panics happen, is because the South African police, and I'm not sure if it's the same in the context of Kenya or the context of Nairobi, where you have these moral panics and then the police, because of public pressure and this kind of performative acts they have to do to demonstrate that they're powerful, to demonstrate that they have some form of legitimacy, have to respond in kind of very militaristic and aggressive ways. And in the South African context, they respond through saturation policing or crackdown policing, or is the euphemistic term that's used in South Africa, high density policing. So you flood a particular area with police when there is a kind of an outcry about something, whether it's high levels of gang violence, or it's, in the case of South Africa recently, with extortion networks operating very violently and competing with each other very violently, and you're seeing a lot of people dying or being hurt as a result of that. And so that, for me, is quite interesting around, because it kind of closes down for a certain degree of time all of these arrangements that have been put in place around the permissible space between the different operators in there, because now the police have to demonstrate that they're powerful, demonstrate that they have capacity. And I would be interested around your sort of response on that. Does that happen in the context of Nairobi? Because you do allude to it in your article, and you certainly did make reference to it in your presentation. So I'd be interested to find out about that. I would also be interested in this issue of agency, because you do speak a lot to it, but it's about the sort of personalities and characteristics of police, because I've certainly noticed in the work that I've done in South Africa and the reading of other scholars, is often a station commander, or you have at a much higher level as what we call cluster commanders, and their sort of senior management staff, often their preferences and their relationships in the community have quite a considerable influence on around how this permissive space is negotiated and the actors and all of that. Some are more laissez-faire and hands-off, and sort of allow these different actors a lot more autonomy, where others try and build relationships themselves, and as a result, the flexibility and autonomy that the other actors have is quite limited. So I would be really interested in your kind of views about that. I mean, did you see any role of these particular individuals in this kind of permissive space? Just trying to think around. You kind of talked a lot about kind of discretion and corruption. I would really sort of like to ask, more, maybe reflecting more on that, around to what degree, because you indicated that the boda drivers are paying certain bribes. Are they paying it to individual police, or is this going to, in a way, the sort of police station where all police members in that station are benefiting from it? And as a result, you're by paying a bribe, you are, in a way, kind of gaining a certain license to do something. But if that's not the case, if you're just, in a way, bribing one particular police member, does this mean you have to bribe multiple police members? So it's that just kind of sense of around what degree is the policing entity, the state policing entity, behaving in a kind of coherent and logical way, Or is it about these sort of different actors, particularly the boda drivers, have to negotiate with multiple individuals in this sort of space? And I don't want to take up too much more time because there are other people, I'm sure we have lots of questions, but in reading your article, the one thing that sort of stood out for me, and you didn't really mention in your presentation, was, but you spoke about these kind of public meetings where the police gang, particularly around the Confirm gang, and the police response was that they wanted to, or had engaged in a form of collective punishment against younger men, that they would target younger men as a particular population and use collective punishment as a way to try and demonstrate power, as a way to try and discourage these kind of acts from happening. And they would let go those they regarded as innocent. Maybe if you can talk a little bit more about that. And finally, I'm kind of throwing questions at you. You can, I suppose, pick and choose about what you want to do. Was also the sense of using, when the sort of boda drivers and other forms of kind of security safety providers, policing actors, in the context, you spoke in your article, drawing on your field research, that these groups would perpetrate violence against alleged criminals, and they would use their discretion about how much violence they used. And it was fascinating that they will use violence to the point that they feel that the message has been carried out, that the punishment has fitted the crime, but it's left up to individual discretion for the person who's perpetrating the violence. So I'd maybe ask if you could maybe reflect on that as well. So I've thrown a lot of things at you, but I just find your research particularly fascinating, and I think contributes to much better understanding of how police try and navigate the complexity of an informal settlement in kind of African cities, and try and pursue policing by subcontracting others. So excellent article, excellent presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to it. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the article. So back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Guy, for the excellent comments.